You are 16, the silk veil is heavy over your face, damp with the heat of your own breath. Somewhere beyond the lattice walls, a flute weeps in the courtyard. The air smells of rosewater and fear. You have been bathed, perfumed, and dressed. Like a bride, though no vows will be spoken, by dawn, you will either be a wife or a corpse. The palace doors close behind you with a sound like a tomb sealing shut, and you wonder how many footsteps have echoed here before yours, and never returned. Asterisk, if this story chills you, leave a comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe so you don't miss the coming stories. The empire was a jewel set in the sands, sprawling markets under striped awnings, minarets that pierced the sky, and caravans that brought silk from the east and gold from the west. But beneath the beauty ran a current of fear, for the man who ruled it was not merely a sultan, he was a shadow that swallowed light. He had not been born to the throne. His rise was the result of 1,000 betrayals, each step forward purchased in blood. Brothers who might have challenged him were quietly poisoned. Cousins vanished during the night. Even his own father, the old sultan, died under circumstances polite society never dared to name aloud. By the time he ascended the marble days of the audience hall, there were no rivals left, only courtiers. With eyes lowered, lips pressed shut, the empire he inherited was fractured. The provinces whispered of rebellion, and foreign powers circled like wolves. Inside the palace, the harem was not a place of love but a weapon, an instrument to cement loyalty, reward service, and spy on the women who, in turn, spied for him. Every gift was a chain, every chain a test, but it was the first execution that set the course of his legend. The girl was said to be the daughter of a minor official, delicate, with eyes the color of river clay after rain. She was summoned to the sultan's chambers. On the night of her marriage to him, by dawn, she was dead. The official explanation spoke of illness. The truth, whispered by the palace servants, was a blade's swift kiss at the base of her neck. No one knew why. Some claimed she had spoken too freely. Others said the sultan feared betrayal before it could take root. But the reason mattered less than the outcome. The next virgin brought before him faced the same fate, and the next, and the next. It became a tradition, one night of luxury and dread, followed by execution at dawn. In the streets, mothers clutched their daughters tighter. In the palace, silence became a language. The first execution might have been dismissed as an accident, a cruel twist of fate in a palace already known for intrigue. But when the second girl died, and then the third, whispers began to swell like storm clouds over the empire. At first, the court poets and scribes tried to soften the truth. They wrote verses about the sultan's unmatched beauty and his unquenchable thirst for purity, claiming the heavens themselves were jealous of mortal brides who lay beside him. But behind those gilded metaphors was a fact too sharp to ignore. No virgin who spent a night with the sultan lived to see the sun rise twice. The palace began to change. Servants who once laughed softly in the corridors now moved like ghosts. Eunuchs spoke only when spoken to, their eyes darting to the shadows as if the walls themselves could listen. Even the harem's grand matrons, women who had survived decades of palace politics, grew quiet, their usual chatter replaced by the slow, deliberate movements of those who know their lives depend on absolute obedience. Beyond the walls, the city pulsed with fear. Fathers petitioned the palace to spare their daughters from service. Mothers made pilgrimages to shrines, tying ribbons of protection to ancient fig trees. And yet, the flow of young women into the palace did not stop. Some came willingly, seduced by promises of wealth for their families. Others were offered up like sacrificial lambs to curry favor with the throne. It was said the sultan saw no difference between a rival with a sword and a woman with a secret. To him, both were threats that must be silenced before they could draw blood. This belief, or paranoia, birthed the rule that no untouched bride would live beyond her first night. The executions were carried out quietly, without spectacle. A muffled cry, a splash of crimson on silk, the body whisked away before the first call to prayer, and by breakfast, the palace was ready to receive the next chosen girl. Traditions in empires are often born of glory, festivals, coronations, rituals to honor the dead, but here, in the Sultan's court, a tradition was born of fear, sharpened like the scimitar that ended each night what began as a single execution. Hardened into an unspoken law, the Sultan never declared it publicly. No edict was carved into stone, yet everyone in the palace understood. If a virgin entered his bedchamber, her fate was sealed before the moon had even risen. Over time, the machinery of death became disturbingly efficient. There was no fumbling, hesitation, no visible cruelty. The eunuchs who served as executioners moved with the precision of men performing a sacred duty. Their hands were steady, their faces revealed nothing. The act was not rage, not passion, it was routine, and so the palace learned to prepare. The grand matrons who tended the harem began instructing each girl with a calmness that was almost gentle. They told them how to walk, how to kneel, how to lower their gaze so the Sultan might look upon them without offense. They explained how to answer questions without seeming insolent, how to smile without appearing bold. There was no pretense of survival, only the hope of making one's last hours dignified. In this way, the palace became a theater of controlled tragedy. Servants moved like stagehands, arranging silks and lighting lamps, knowing they were setting a scene whose ending would always be the same. Musicians played soft melodies beyond the chamber doors, their notes carrying a bittersweet beauty for ears that would not hear them again. The Sultan never showed joy or grief. If he felt anything, it remained locked behind the same impassive mask he wore in court. To the outside world, he was a ruler maintaining order in dangerous times. To those within the palace walls, he was the executioner in wedding robes, and thus the night without dawn became a fixture of the empire, a ritual so feared, yet so deeply woven into the fabric of power, that no one dared to question it aloud. The summons came at sunset. Two eunuchs, silent as shadows, appeared at the harem's great lattice doors. They carried no weapons. They didn't need them. Their presence alone was enough to draw the breath from the women's lungs. In the dim amber light, they spoke the girl's name. Her friends lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. The grand matrons rose from their cushions. They moved toward the chosen girl with the air of priests preparing an offering. There was no question, no plea for mercy. Instead, they took her by the hands and led her to the bathhouse, where steam curled upward in soft, ghostly tendrils. The water was perfumed with rose petals and saffron. As the matrons washed her skin, they murmured instructions in low, steady tones, not of survival, but of composure. Do not meet his gaze too long. Speak only when asked, and whatever happens, do not cry out. Their voices were neither cruel nor kind. They had repeated these words too many times to let emotion soften them. After the bath came the oils, thick and golden, rubbed into her arms, her hair, her neck. The scent was intoxicating. Clinging to the air like memory, layers of silk were brought in, each one finer than the last, shimmering in the lamplight. The dress was the color of pomegranate seeds, its hem heavy with gold thread. The veil was nearly weightless, yet it seemed to press down on her as though spun from iron. When they were finished, she looked like a bride from the old poems, a figure of beauty meant to inspire love. But everyone in the room knew this was no wedding night. Outside, the sound of the evening call to prayer drifted through the palace. Its final note faded into silence. The eunuchs waited just beyond the threshold, their expressions unreadable. It was time. The journey from the harem to the Sultan's private chambers was not far in distance, yet it felt endless. Two eunuchs led the way, their steps perfectly measured, their soft leather slippers making no sound on the polished marble. Behind them, the girl walked with her head lowered, the veil dimming her vision to a narrow frame of gilded floor tiles and the occasional flicker of torchlight. The grand matrons followed several paces behind, as if to ensure she would not turn back. The corridors seemed to breathe. Cool drafts whispered through carved lattice windows, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below. The air was thick with incense, a sweet smoke curling from bronze censers mounted on the walls. Shadows shifted across The intricate mosaics, scenes of past conquests, battles immortalized in stone, each warrior frozen in a moment of triumph. She wondered if any of those warriors had ever felt as powerless as she did now. Every so often, they passed guards in ceremonial armor, their spears crossed in silent acknowledgment. None spoke, none moved. Even their eyes remained fixed straight ahead, as though the very sight of her was dangerous. She tried to count her steps, as if the rhythm might anchor her. 12 between each turn, 16 down the long gallery, 8 more to the carved cedar doors of the Sultan's wing. The numbers blurred as her heartbeat quickened. They passed through an archway where the light changed, warmer, golden, spilling from lanterns fitted with sheets of polished amber. The sound of a distant flute drifted toward her, its melody slow and deliberate, each note lingering as if it, too, was reluctant to move forward. Finally, they reached a set of towering doors inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The eunuchs paused, one step forward, knocking softly. 3 measured taps that seemed to echo far too loud in the stillness. From within came a voice, calm, deep, unhurried. Enter. The cedar doors opened without a creak, as if even the wood feared to disturb him. The chamber beyond was bathed in a dim, golden glow. Lanterns hung low, their flames flickering against walls draped in embroidered silk. The air was heavy with the scent of wood, deep, smoky, almost intoxicating. The girl stepped inside, her slippers sinking into a carpet so thick it seemed to swallow her footsteps. The eunuchs closed the doors behind her with a slow, deliberate motion, and she was alone. The Sultan sat at the far end of the room, reclined on a divan strewn with cushions. His robes were black tonight, edged in gold, a sharp contrast to the pale gleam of the curved dagger at his side. His face was unreadable, not cruel, not kind, just still. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply studied her, as though she were a document he intended to memorize before sealing it away. She felt the weight of that gaze, pressing through the veil, stripping away the layers of silk until only her fear remained. Come closer, he said at last. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her across the room in small, careful steps. She stopped when she was near enough to hear the soft rustle of his robes as he shifted. The Sultan gestured to a low table between them. Upon it lay a plate of figs, their skin split and glistening with syrup. Beside them, a goblet of dark wine caught the lantern light. Eat, he instructed. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a fig. The sweetness filled her mouth, but the taste was laced with dread. When she looked up, he was still watching her, the way a hawk watches a small bird fluttering at the edge of its reach. And in that moment, she knew the truth. The night had only just begun, but her fate was already sealed. The chamber was silent except for the faint crackle of a brazier in the corner. Shadows swayed across the walls, long and thin, bending with each flicker of the flame. The Sultan leaned back, his gaze still fixed on her, but now softer, or perhaps more calculated. Sit, he said, gesturing to the cushion opposite him. She obeyed, arranging her silk skirts so they fell neatly around her, hands folded in her lap. For a time, there was no conversation. He poured the wine, the dark liquid, catching the light like polished garnet. He filled his own cup first, then hers, and lifted his in a silent command. She took a sip. The warmth of it slid down her throat, loosening her chest, but only slightly. You are quiet, he observed at last. Her voice felt fragile in her mouth. I was told to be. That earned the faintest curve of his lips, not quite a smile. And do you always do as you're told? She lowered her gaze, unsure if it was safer to lie or to speak the truth. Yes, my lord. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Good. Obedience is a rare jewel. His tone was almost gentle, but there was an undercurrent in it, the kind that promised rewards and punishments in equal measure. He began asking questions then, where she was from, what her father did, whether she could read or sing. His voice was low, steady, and for a moment, she almost forgot why she was there. He listened closely, as if each answer was a clue to a puzzle only he understood. And yet, beneath his composure, there was something else, a tension in his shoulders, the faint twitch of his fingers near the hilt of his dagger. when he finally reached for a fig. He tore it open with his hands, the juice running down his knuckles. He looked at her as he ate, his eyes never breaking contact. It was the look of a man who was not deciding whether she would die, but how. The change was subtle at first, a pause between questions, a stillness in his movements, as if the warmth in the room had suddenly cooled. The Sultan set aside his cup and leaned back, his fingers drumming softly on the arm of the divan. "Remove the veil," he said. Her hands moved without thought, finding the edge of the gauzy silk and lifting it away. The air felt heavier on her skin, as though the room itself had shifted closer. She placed the veil neatly on the table beside the figs. His eyes swept over her face, not hungrily, but like an appraiser studying the grain of fine wood or the cut of a gemstone. "Stand," he ordered. She rose, keeping her eyes low. Closer. Her bare feet sank into the carpet as she obeyed. She could hear her own heartbeat now, a drum against her ribs. He reached out, taking a lock of her hair between his fingers. "They told me your hair was like autumn leaves," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, abruptly, "Kneel." Her knees touched the thick rug, the scent of wood stronger here, mingled with the faint tang of metal from the dagger at his side. "You were sent to me as a gift," he said, his voice smooth but weighted with something colder. "A gift can please, or it can disappoint. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord." His hand lingered in her hair a moment longer, then dropped away. He rose, his height casting her into shadow. "I have had many gifts," he continued. "Some were delicate, some were strong, all were fleeting." He moved past her, toward the window where the lattice cast patterns of gold on his robes. "But I decide how long they remain." When he turned back, the kindness in his face was gone. What replaced it was something precise, controlled, and dangerous. She realized then that every moment until now had been an examination, a weighing of worth, and whatever he had decided, the answer would not save her. The rest of the night passed in a haze, a blur of commands and silences, of gestures meant to test her compliance. The Sultan's words came less often now, replaced by the quiet authority of a man who no longer needed them. At times, he spoke, almost tenderly, offering her pomegranate seeds or pouring her more wine. At others, his touch was abrupt, as if reminding her that tenderness here was not a promise but a performance. She understood that everything in this chamber was a transaction, and the price was already set. Hours crawled by, the brazier burned low, its embers winking like tired stars. Somewhere beyond the walls, a night bird called once, then fell silent. She began to notice every sound, the faint scuff of his slippers as he moved, the distant splash of a fountain in the courtyard, the subtle sigh of the wind against the lattice screens. Her body ached from stillness, yet she dared not shift. Too much. She thought of the women before her, their final hours spent beneath this same ceiling, their breath filling the same air. Did they know the exact moment their fate had been sealed? Or was it, like this, a slow tightening, an invisible rope drawing closer with each passing minute? When the Sultan finally dismissed her to a smaller adjoining room, it was not with cruelty but with a calm so cold it felt merciful. The door closed behind her, leaving her alone with a single oil lamp and a narrow couch draped in white linen. She did not sleep, her ears strained for the sound she knew must come, and it did. Soft footsteps in the hall, the whisper of steel as a blade was drawn, the latch lifted, and as the first pale light of dawn bled into the lattice, the guards entered. In the palace, silence was not simply the absence of sound. It was a language. It passed between the eyes of eunuchs in the corridors, in the bowed heads of scribes, in the careful way servants set down trays so the silver did not clink too loudly. The Sultan's harem was not merely a place of women. It was an intricate machine of power, greased by fear and obedience. Every person inside its walls, from the youngest maid to the oldest matron, was a cog in that machine, and each understood that their own survival depended on keeping it turning. The eunuchs were the most visible enforcers of this unspoken order. Castrated as boys, they were trained for absolute loyalty. They held the keys to every door, carried messages between chambers, and knew more secrets than any minister or soldier. They saw the girls arrive, they saw them leave, and yet no word ever slipped from their lips, not because they did not feel pity, but because pity was dangerous. Then there were the viziers and ministers, the political class who dined with the Sultan and toasted his health. They knew, too, but for them, the deaths of a few young women were weighed against the stability of the throne. The empire was encircled by enemies. They could not afford dissent within its walls. If the Sultan's peculiar cruelty kept him sharp, then so be it. Even the religious scholars, whose duty it was to speak moral truth, found ways to cloak their silence in piety. They quoted verses about divine will, about the power of kings being ordained by heaven. It was not their place, they said, to question God's chosen ruler. And so the web held fast, strands of fear, loyalty, ambition, and self-preservation knotted so tightly that to pull one loose would risk collapsing the entire structure. Outside, the people whispered. Inside, the palace listened and remembered. In an empire where the Sultan's word carried the weight of divine decree, religion and politics were not separate forces. They were threads of the same cloth, woven together so tightly that one could not be pulled without unraveling the other. The executions, though never officially proclaimed, began to gather their own justifications. Court scholars spoke of purity and honor, twisting sacred texts into tools of compliance. They suggested that the Sultan's actions were an act of divine protection, that by taking the life of a virgin after one night, he preserved her from the corruption of the world. It was a grotesque inversion of mercy, but it sounded noble enough for those who needed to believe it. Politically, the practice served an unspoken purpose. Every girl who entered the palace was the daughter of someone important, a provincial governor, a wealthy merchant, a tribal leader. To be chosen was an honor that bound her family more tightly to the throne, even if it meant her death. Refusing such an honor was unthinkable, a public insult to the Sultan that could strip a family of its lands, titles, or even their lives. Foreign envoys who visited the court heard the rumors but rarely dared to speak of them. Those who did were met with polite smiles and dismissive laughter, as if the very suggestion were an absurd foreign misunderstanding. Behind the scenes, however, the Sultan's ministers made sure the practice remained a quiet deterrent, a reminder to allies and rivals alike. The Sultan feared nothing, not even the wrath of the heavens for shedding innocent blood, some claimed. The tradition began after a betrayal, that the first bride had conspired against him, and the Sultan vowed never again to allow an untouched woman close enough to harm him. Others said it was not betrayal he feared, but attachment. Killing them after one night ensured no bond could ever soften his judgment. Whatever the truth, the reasoning no longer mattered. The story had hardened into a kind of law, one written, not in ink, but in the silent acceptance of all who benefited from it. For the families whose daughters were chosen, grief arrived long before death. When the royal summons came, it was delivered with ceremony, silk banners, armed escorts, and a sealed letter bearing the Sultan's mark. Neighbors would gather to witness the moment, offering hollow congratulations, their eyes betraying pity. They dared not speak. Mothers bit their lips to keep from trembling, while fathers forced smiles, reciting the old lie, "She goes to serve the Sultan. What greater honor could we have?" Behind closed doors, the truth was unbearable. The family knew their daughter would return only in a coffin, shrouded in white, her face untouched but her soul stolen. Yet refusal was not an option. Refusing meant treason. Treason meant the news, and often the ruin of the entire bloodline. For some, the choice was survival. They reasoned that losing one child was better than losing them all. Others convinced themselves that perhaps the rumors were wrong, that their daughter might be the exception, that the Sultan's heart might soften. But in the palace's long history, no such miracle had ever occurred. In the weeks before the summons was fulfilled, mothers whispered final prayers into their daughters' ears, sewing amulets into their garments, not to protect them from harm, but to guide their souls quickly into the afterlife. Fathers gave final blessings, their voices breaking. Unable to say what they truly felt, the day of departure was a performance. The daughter, dressed in gold and crimson, rode in a gilded carriage as if going to a wedding feast. The streets would cheer, musicians would play, and the family would wave until she vanished from sight. But when the last note of music faded and the crowd dispersed, the house would grow unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ribs until it hurt to breathe. Those who had given their daughters rarely spoke of it again. They buried their grief under layers of formality and ceremony, because in the Sultan's empire, even sorrow had to obey. The Sultan's court was a theater of power, where every word was a performance and every silence was calculated. Marble columns soared above polished floors, and the air smelled faintly of rosewater, but beneath the perfume lay something sharper, the metallic tang of suspicion. Here, the Sultan's ministers and advisers moved like actors bound to an invisible script. Smiles were warm but rarely reached the eyes, compliments dripped with flattery, but each carried a hidden blade. Even laughter felt dangerous, for in this court, a misplaced joke could travel to the wrong ears and end in exile. Or worse, it was not the Sultan's cruelty alone that kept the court in line, but the knowledge that he heard everything. Servants poured wine and carried trays of figs, but their true duty was to listen. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors not only to keep order, but to collect murmurs, rumors, and sighs. A casual remark at a banquet could return to the Sultan's ears by dawn. The ministers knew that the Sultan's moods could turn with the wind. In the morning, he might reward a man with estates and gold. By nightfall, that same man's body might hang in the courtyard, accused of treachery. It was said that in the palace archives, there were ledgers of such punishments, neat lists of names, each followed by the method of their end, as if they were nothing more than accounts of trade. Still, every man sought the Sultan's favor, for his gifts were as magnificent as his wrath was terrible. A single smile from the throne could elevate a low-born clerk to the rank of vizier. A nod of approval could fill one's coffers for a lifetime. But each gift came wrapped in invisible chains, and once tied to the Sultan's generosity, a man could never escape. Among the courtiers, the most dangerous game was not survival, but advancement. To rise in this court meant to outwit rivals, to speak without speaking, and to keep secrets not only from the Sultan, but from oneself, for even your own thoughts might betray you if they slipped into words. If the palace was the heart of the Sultan's power, his network of spies was the blood that carried his will to every corner of the empire. They moved unseen through markets, mosques, caravanserais, and taverns, blending into the crowd like shadows at sunset. Merchants who counted coins too quickly, imams who spoke too boldly, travelers who asked too many questions, all could find their words carried back to the capital within days. Some spies posed as beggars, their dirty faces hiding sharp, observant eyes. Others wore the robes of scholars, asking polite questions about local grievances while memorizing the names of those who dared to complain. They had no single master's face to serve. Many never saw the Sultan at all. Instead, they answered to layers of intermediaries, men and women whose loyalty was bought not just with gold, but with fear. A spy who failed in his duty was not punished with death alone. His family might vanish, his name erased from the records. As though he had never walked the earth, the network thrived on paranoia. In some towns, men whispered only in courtyards where fountains drowned their voices, fearing the walls themselves might be listening. In others, letters were written in code or delivered through a chain of trusted messengers. Yet even then, messages found their way to the palace. The Sultan's reach was a ghost, never seen, but always felt. It was said that a rebellion in the distant mountains had been crushed before the rebels had even drawn their first swords. The leader's brother, a mild-mannered spice seller, had unknowingly shared a casual remark with a traveler. That traveler was a spy. Within a fortnight, the rebels were in chains, and the spice seller's stall was empty. In the capital, this invisible grip ensured loyalty. Outside it, it kept distant provinces trembling. The Sultan's subjects understood a bitter truth. The empire's walls were built not from stone alone, but from the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always listening. His name in the palace records was Farid ibn Yasin, but outside those walls, he wore a dozen names like layers of old clothing. In the spice markets of Aleppo, he was Hassan the trader. In the coastal ports, he became Abdul the sailor to the tribes of the desert. He was no one at all, just a traveler with dust in his beard and stories in his mouth. Farid's latest mission was a silent one, the kind that left no trace in royal decrees. A provincial governor in the city of Kazan had been speaking with envoys from a rival kingdom. The Sultan wanted to know what was promised, and to whom. Farid was given a single order: find the truth before it finds a sword. He entered Kazan not through its gates, but through the stables of a merchant he had once saved from ruin. For 3 days, he posed as an itinerant scribe, offering to write letters for those who could not hold a pen, words spoken by farmers and servants often revealed more than the proclamations of kings. One evening, a stable boy whispered that the governor would be dining with strangers at the House of Pomegranates, a grand inn near the city's eastern wall. Farid dressed as a wine seller and carried a jug into the banquet hall. Bowing low to hide his face, he caught fragments of the conversation: promises of gold, a shipment of weapons, and a map sealed in wax. It was enough. That night, under the pale light of the moon, Farid hid the message inside the lining of his shoe and began the journey back to the capital. But halfway to the next town, he sensed it, the feeling of being followed. A shadow moved where there should have been none, a twig cracked behind him on an empty road. Farid knew the Sultan's spies were not the only hunters in the empire. Some worked for the highest bidder, and others worked to silence their own. And in that moment, Farid wondered if he had just become the prey. The events of this mission revealed more than just a single act of treachery. They peeled back the fragile veneer of loyalty that held the Sultan's empire together. Farid had navigated a maze of dust-choked roads, double-faced allies, and deadly silences to deliver his findings. The betrayal he uncovered was not an isolated crack. It was a fracture running deep through the heart of the court. In the capital, victory was never absolute. A loyal servant today could be tomorrow's conspirator. A whispered promise could become a dagger in the dark. The Sultan's grip on power depended not on armies alone, but on a delicate balance of fear, favor, and secrets, and Farid had just tipped that balance. As he walked away from the palace that evening, the call to prayer washed over the city like a reminder of a higher order. But Farid knew better. In the empire's undercurrents, faith and ambition often danced to different drums. The quiet had returned, but it was the kind that comes before a storm. Somewhere beyond the city walls, new shadows were gathering, and Farid would have to face them, because in the Sultan's world, a mission's end was never the end at all.